Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 387. Thank you for joining me. Happy Friday. Hope you guys had a great week. We're going to get back into talking about the Maccabean Revolt in this podcast, get back into that history. I have a lot to share with you guys. I have a great podcast. But I want to start by talking about Barack Obama and his administration. I voted for Barack Obama in 2008. I was an independent voter back then. I was so repulsed by the 8 years of the Bush administration. I believed that Barack Obama was a unifier, that he could be a unifier. And then when he was elected, I've told this story many times. Even before he was sworn into office, just by the people that he was bringing into his cabinet and the type of people that he was bringing onto his financial team. At that time, we were in the middle of a financial crisis. This guy's bringing on Larry Summers to lead his economic team. He's putting Timothy Geithner in Treasury Secretary. Immediately, Hillary Clinton at the State Department. I knew I'd been had. But I voted for him because I believed in all the stuff that he was running on. He ran as a uniter. He did not unite the country. He divided the country very intentionally. And the way that I saw the country being divided under the Obama administration was very orchestrated. I saw the way the word racism was weaponized during the Obama administration to avoid any criticism of Obama. Anyone who would criticize Obama, the only reason that you're criticizing him is because you must be racist. You know what I mean? This was something that was done many times. You can't, you don't like his foreign policy? It's because you're racist. Oh, you don't like Obamacare? It's because you're racist. Any criticism that was made of Obama, it was because, he didn't do that. No, he didn't do that at all. And Obama, if he's anything, he is crafty. Let's just say that. He always, seemed to be above it all. He let his surrogates do the accusations of racism. His surrogates in the media, MSNBC, CNN, the talking heads, they would make the accusations of racism. Surrogates from within his administration, they would make the accusations of racism, but he always maintained a degree of plausible deniability, and that he would play into it, and the way that he would play into it, this is a mixed race guy that grew up in California, raised by his white grandparents, and he always presented himself like he was Huey P. Newton or something. He played into it very subtly. And yeah, any criticisms of Obama, still to this day, can't criticize the guy, or you must be racist. And I saw the way racism was being weaponized, and it had a huge impact on me. First of all, I'm a black man in America. I know what real racism is. Criticizing Obama because he invades Libya and removes Gaddafi from power, or whatever your criticisms of Obama was, that don't make you racist because you criticize Obama's policies. And so I was very sensitive to the fact that racism was being not only being weaponized, the accusations of racism were so being weaponized that it kind of made the term racism, real accusations. There's real racism out there, but real accusations of racism were not taken seriously because the word racism was, overused and used in situations that were not racism, just to deflect from criticizing Obama. Anyway, I say all that to say that I'm noticing the same thing with the term anti-Semitic. I'm noticing that calling people anti-Semitic is a way to to divert from criticism. If I have criticism, then I'm immediately anti-Semitic. Because of the issue of racism, I'm very sensitive to seeing this with anti-Semitism. And yeah, it's the same thing with Obama. If I don't like you don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, you must be an anti-Semite. How could you not like Benjamin Netanyahu? I don't like Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't trust Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't trust the word that comes out of his mouth. Doesn't mean that I hate Jews or that I even have a problem with Israel. But I have a problem with Netanyahu. I have a problem with the Likud. I have a problem with Smotrich. I have a problem with Ben Gvir. I have a problem with many others like him and like them. But I don't have a problem with Israel. I have a problem with the Jews just because I have a problem with those people. And that's not anti-Semitic, but I've noticed there, even the ADL, there's this art. I wish I had it up here. Let's see if I can find it. The ADL said that if you criticize George Soros, it's anti-Semitic. Criticisms of George Soros are anti-Semitic, is what the ADL said. And it's just a way to deflect from criticism. Here it is right here. Soros conspiracy theories. The protests, a gateway to anti-Semitism. Gateway to anti-Semitism if you criticize this guy who, destroys countries, causes wars, gets rich off of manipulating currencies all over the world. He, has destabilized, Ukraine, destabilized the United States. But you better not say that. It's anti-Semitism. Been noticing the exact same thing. So we've been talking about the Maccabean Revolt and Antiochus Epiphanes, and all of a sudden Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, he invades Judea where the Jews are. He storms into the temple. He desecrates the temple, putting up idols to Zeus, sacrificing swine at the temple, disgracing the Jewish temple. And this just came out of nowhere. And we've been asking the questions, why? It'd be easy just to pass it off as anti-Semitism. Well, the reason Antiochus Epiphanes did this is because he's an anti-Semite, of course. That's it. That the Jews are God's chosen people, and it was spiritual. That's what was motivating Antiochus Epiphanes. Was he was an anti-Semite, and he uncontrollably couldn't help himself from just persecuting the Jews and hating the Jews. No, there are some other reasons, some deeper reasons that I want to look at, and that we started looking at 2 podcasts ago, asking the question now, what were the issues that was facing Antiochus Epiphanes? Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, his father, Antiochus the Great, had kind of stabilized the Seleucid Empire. During his reign, he had lost the territory to the Romans in Asia Minor, but he had gained back a lot of territory that Ptolemy III had taken from the Seleucids, and he was able to bring the area of Judea, where Jerusalem was, where the Jews were. He was able to bring that territory under the realm of the Seleucids during Antiochus the Great. But Antiochus the Great left his son, Antiochus IV, with a lot of issues that were still destabilizing the Seleucid Empire, and he was facing quite a bit of things that were separate from what was going on in Judea, but could have contributed to his actions in Judea, which started the Maccabean Revolt. And this is all. Let's take a brief rewind here and go back into history a little bit, because this is all that we're talking about. It's all about the Maccabean Revolt. The reason that we're talking about the Maccabean Revolt and why it's so important, we started talking about this period of time, this 600 years that is called the Second Temple period. This is the period after the Babylonian exile. And when the Jews go back after the Persia conquers the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great gives a decree for the Jews to return to Zion. That's what it says here. Return to Zion. What does it say here? Let's read this. Return to Zion. The return to Zion is an event recorded in Ezra, Nehemiah, in the Hebrew Bible, as Jews in the kingdom of Judah, subjected by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, were freed from the Babylonian captivity following the Persian conquest of Babylon. And Cyrus the Great gives the Edict of Cyrus. And this takes us back. The Edict of Cyrus. What is the Edict of Cyrus? Let's read that. The Edict of Cyrus usually refers to the biblical account proclamations by Cyrus the Great, the founding king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, in 539 BC, where he issued after the Persian conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he gives the decree for the Jews to return to Zion, but to return to Zion with a purpose, not only to rebuild the city, but to rebuild the temple. That was all part of the decree. Go back to Jerusalem. The return to this is the second Zionist movement, where the Jews leave Babylon. A small contingent of Jews led by Zerubbabel go back to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. And this is the Edict of Cyrus. And this takes us back to what I was talking about in the last podcast about the British mandate. Now, the Jews, after the Persians conquer Babylon, if Cyrus wanted to keep the Jews in captivity, he could have. He had the power to do that. I mean, he was the king of the most powerful empire on the planet at this time, the Medo-Persian Empire. If Cyrus wanted to keep the Jews in captivity and not allow them to go back and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple and keep them in captivity in Babylon, he had the power to do that. He could have done that. Now, the Bible says, and the book of Daniel, and other places that God, that he intervened on Cyrus. He led Cyrus to show compassion, and Cyrus did not only show compassion for the Jews. Everyone who the Babylonians had captured were allowed to go back and practice their religions in peace. He gives the decree, but it's the Edict of Cyrus that gives that decree. Cyrus, it didn't, it wasn't the decree from the Bible or decree from the scriptures. The Jews didn't make a plea and say, our scriptures say that we need to go back. And Cyrus, it wasn't. But basically, what I'm saying, we're asking the question and talking about the biblical mandate versus the British mandate in the last podcast. It was the mandate of Cyrus that allowed the Jews to go back to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple after the Persians conquer Babylon. Just like the mandate of the British after World War I, you have the mandate of Cyrus. Now, Jews and Christians, us that believe the Bible, we can believe that God had compassion, or turned Cyrus's heart and had compassion on them, and he led Cyrus to issue this decree, that God intervened on the heart of Alfred Balfour and moved Arthur Balfour to give the Balfour Declaration. Yes, we can believe that, but what actually happened was the British mandate and the Edict of Cyrus. So the Jews go back and return to rebuild the temple, and that's what starts what we've been talking about, the Second Temple period. The Maccabean Revolt happens in the Second Temple period. That's why we're talking about all of this. This is the statue that Daniel interprets the dream from Nebuchadnezzar and tells him about the four kingdoms that will come in succession in the region to rule over the Jewish people, because before the Babylonian captivity happens. Before the Babylonian captivity, there were Jewish kings. The Jewish lived under their own kingdoms. They had complete sovereignty, and they had, under one kingdom under David and Solomon. And then after Solomon dies, then they split up into two different kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel to the north, the kingdom of Judah to the north. Notice this map. Notice this map here, where the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah was. It's the same map of today, pretty much. If you got the West Bank and but the Gaza part, I mean, that wasn't part of the map. What I'm saying to you is that even back before the Babylonian captivity, you didn't have this Greater Israel map. We're going to talk about Greater Israel in a moment. This is the map that Tucker Carlson pressed Mike Huckabee on, from the Nile to the Euphrates, encompassing Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, parts of Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia. This is the Greater Israel map. Notice that during the time of the kings, during the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, the map was not a map of Greater Israel. So the book of Genesis says from the Nile to the Euphrates, it wasn't under the reign of David. It wasn't under the reign of Solomon and the kings after. So the Babylonian captivity happens. And then after the Babylonian captivities, this period of the Second Temple period is marked by the Jews being under Gentile rule. They no longer have Jewish kings. They're under Gentile rule. And these are the ruling kingdoms that will rule over the Jews during Gentile rule. That's what this statue and this dream and this interpretation of the dream was all about. But there's this one period here in the Greek Empire, a small period of time, a century of time in this 600-year period where you have Jewish kings again, and that is during the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty was a Jewish ruling dynasty of Judea during the Hellenistic times of the Second Temple period. The dynasty ruled Judea semi-autonomously within the Seleucid Empire. Why does it say semi-autonomously? Because, because the Seleucids had so many other problems that they were dealing with. They were dealing with the rise of Rome. They were still fighting the Ptolemies in Egypt. There were still breakaway regions that were going on in the far east part of the empire. They didn't have time to come and continue fighting the Jews there in Judea, so they left them alone to establish this semi-autonomous dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty, and the Hasmoneans begin using the title of king again, right here. The Hasmonean rulers took the Greek title Basileus, king. They took the title king. So for the first time, you have kings again, because you don't have any kings, during the Babylonian captivity anymore. And then after the Babylonian captivity, they're under the Persians, and then under the Greeks for the majority of the part of this time. And then they have this 100-year period during the Hasmonean dynasty where they have kings again. So they're back to kings for about 100 years until the Romans intervene, because they're having civil war. You have the Hasmonean Civil War. We'll get into talking about that in a period of time, but it says right here, forces of the Roman Republic intervene in the Hasmonean Civil War in 63 BC, turning the kingdom into a client state. So then they go under the rule of the Romans again. They go from this semi-autonomous state back to under the reign of the Romans, and then they're under the reign of the iron at that time. That's the story that we're telling. That's the story that we're telling, and we're asking the question, why all of a sudden did Antiochus Epiphanes do what he did when he raided the temple, when he desecrated the temple, when he started persecuting the Jews? Because when he does that is the first time in 400 years since the Babylonian captivity that the Jews are persecuted. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes wasn't the first person to persecute the Jews at all. I mean, they were in exile. They come out of exile. I mean, that means that they had to be persecuted by the Babylonians. I mean, what motivated the Babylonians to persecute the Jews? Before the Babylonians persecuted the Jews, the Assyrians. The Assyrians scattered the northern 10 tribes. What motivated the Assyrians to scatter the northern 10 tribes? Was it antisemitism? Were the Assyrians motivated by antisemitism? Were the Babylonians motivated by antisemitism? Was it Antiochus IV Epiphanes motivated by antisemitism? Well, we know, according to Jewish texts, according to their own scripture, we know why the Assyrians attacked the northern 10 tribes and scattered them. According to their own scriptures, according to the Jewish text, the Bible says, God says that he gave the northern 10 tribes to the Syrians. That he caused just like the Bible says that God caused Cyrus the Great's heart to be softened and for him to show compassion to the Jewish people. The Hebrew Bible says that he caused the Assyrians to come in, and that he wanted the Assyrians to come in and scatter the northern 10 tribes. Why? Because they were practicing witchcraft. They were practicing adultery. They were setting up idols. When the Babylonians come in to take the kingdom of Judah and to subjugate the kingdom of Judah, the Bible says, you can go and read in the book of Kings, it says that just like I gave the northern 10 tribes to the Assyrians, I'm going to give the kingdom of Judah to the Babylonians because of your disobedience, because of you set up. Antiochus Epiphanes, people, when he goes into the temple in the 2nd century BC and desecrates the temple, set up idols to Zeus, make sacrifices of swine to his Egyptian gods in the temple, and desecrates the temple, he's not even the first person to do something like that. The very first person to do something like that is Manasseh, a Jewish king who went into the temple, set up idols in the temple, desecrated the temple. A Jewish king did that long before Antiochus IV. And God said, because of Manasseh and people like Manasseh who have turned the Jewish people away, set up idols, witchcraft, and corruption, all this stuff that you've done, then I'm going to send the Assyrians. I'm going to send the Babylonians to persecute you. So did God send Antiochus IV to persecute the Jews? Who knows? That could be the reason. Or it could just be anti-Semitism. The point that I want to make is that this action that Antiochus took came out of nowhere. And it is what launched the Maccabean revolt and what led to the Hasmonean dynasty. And the Hasmonean dynasty, if you go and read the rest of this here, that the Romans intervened in their civil war, turned their client state to an irreversible decline. Hasmonean power, Herod the Great displaced the last reigning Hasmonean client ruler, Herod the Great. Well, who's Herod the Great? You read your Bible, you know that this is the period of time under Herod where Jesus is born. So all of this leads up to the birth of Jesus. He's being born in this time. So you understand the conditions that Jesus is being born into. It's on the heels of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty. And there's something else that you need to understand about the Maccabean revolt. The Maccabean revolt was the first Jewish revolt in 3 centuries of revolting. So the Maccabean revolt starts off what becomes 3 centuries of revolts. The Maccabean revolt is the first Jewish revolt, and the last Jewish revolt is the Bar Kokhba revolt. So from the Maccabean revolt to the Bar Kokhba revolt, why were the Jews in Judea in this constant state of revolting against first the Seleucids, and then when the Romans take over, many revolts against the Romans. Like when Titus goes into Judea in 70 AD, and he destroys the temple and destroys everything. That's kind of like the last straw. He's like, we've been dealing with all of these different revolts, and you guys revolting against us for centuries now. Titus goes in and destroys the temple. And if you notice that the Bar Kokhba revolt, and this last revolt doesn't take place until 70 years after the destruction of the temple. So even when Titus goes in and destroys the temple in 70 AD, they continue to revolt after the temple is destroyed. So the very first revolt is the Maccabean revolt, and you have revolts that against the Greeks and the Romans that take place from the Maccabean revolt, kind of inspired by the Maccabean revolt, all the way to the Bar Kokhba revolt. So again, asking the question, what was Antiochus Epiphanes doing? What was motivating him? Why did he do this? Okay, so what we talked again in 2 podcasts ago about the issues that Antiochus was facing. Well, his father had lost a very important territory in Asia Minor to the Romans. I want to say this before I'm getting off track, but I want to say this about the Romans. And I think this is important. I was thinking about this because Antiochus III loses all of this territory in Asia Minor to the Romans. This is what the empires looked like after Alexander the Great dies and the wars kind of settled down, and you've broken up into these 3 regions outside of Macedonia, 4 regions if you include Macedonia. But the largest and most powerful regions were the Ptolemies, Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire. And the Romans, when they come on the scene, the reason that they're able to be so successful is that they played all of these different Greeks against each other. Like, I was asking myself the question, could the Romans even have risen to power if all of the Greeks would have stayed united after Alexander the Great died? If instead of centuries of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids going warfare back and forth with each other, and they were united and they were focusing their attention on repelling the Romans, could the Romans have even risen to power? I ask that because the Romans were playing them off of each other. As a matter of fact, the Romans had a alliance with the Ptolemies, of course, because the Ptolemies were the breadbasket and they had all the grain and everything. But even we talked about how, the the Seleucids were losing territory to the Romans, and how the war between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were weakening the Seleucid Empire. But we haven't talked much about how that war was weakening the Ptolemy Empire, because it was having an effect in Egypt as well. Anyway, the Romans were playing them off of each other. They had an alliance with the Ptolemies. The Romans had defeated Antiochus III in Asia Minor, and Antiochus III had to sign a treaty giving up all of their territory in Asia Minor, important ports territory where there's tax revenue that they're losing. So the Seleucid Empire is suffering financial problems. You had breakaway regions to the east. You still had the internal battles from the succession crisis, and there was a lot of different issues that Antiochus the Fourth was dealing with. A lot of pressure on him, mostly because of the war between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and the rise of the Romans, which is not, those issues are not independent of each other, because again, the Romans and the Ptolemies had formed an alliance. But like I said, when Antiochus Epiphanes, when he takes this action, this strict action of Hellenization, and enforcement of Hellenization on the Jewish people, it came out of nowhere. And the Jews, from the beginning of the Second Temple period, from the time that Cyrus gives the edict for them to go back, to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple, they had enjoyed a tolerance. They enjoyed, long periods of tolerance. Even though they were under the reign of the Persians, the Persians tolerated them and left them alone to do their own thing. They didn't have an army. They weren't conquering territory, but they were left alone to worship at their temple, worship God how they saw fit. They were a little bit weird because they were monotheistic, and why would you limit yourself to one God? But whatever, let those Jews do their thing. They experienced this tolerance, 400 years of tolerance through the Persians, through the beginning of the Greek reign over them, because of course they were part of the Ptolemy empire prior to being captured by the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies had many Jews that lived within Egypt. Like I was telling you, that Ptolemy the second, Philadelphus, is the one that commissioned the translation of the Jewish Bible into Greek, the Septuagint. There were many Jews, very influential Jews, that lived there in Alexandria, in northern Africa, many Jews in his army. So the last thing that the Ptolemies wanted to do was anger the Jews by enforcing anything. And that's just it wasn't their style. It wasn't their style to force, religious, standards and to persecute people on a basis of religious. This was completely out of the ordinary what Antiochus IV does. Even after his father, Antiochus III the Great, brings the region of Judea under the realm of the Seleucid Empire, he didn't persecute them or do anything to, antagonize them, or, he was completely tolerant of them. And on that note, we're going to get back into, I know I've been talking for a long time, but I want to get back into some of these clips. And this was the professor of Pennsylvania, of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Jeremy McInerney. And we listened to some of his lecture in the podcast before last. We're going to listen to him talk about Antiochus IV's father, Antiochus III. We're going to listen to him talk about Antiochus III, his policy towards the Jews in Judea after he brings them into the Seleucid Empire. Take a listen.
Judea, quite simply, in the 2nd century BC, was a peaceful, well-integrated region within the Seleucid realm. The Seleucids ruled a polyethnic empire. They had many different people under their control in Bactria and in the upper satrapies and in Babylon and in Asia Minor for a time. And their attitude, as we've seen on an earlier occasion, was utterly pragmatic. They let people be autonomous as far as possible, and they respected local tradition as far as possible. So it was not in any shape or form in the interest of the Seleucid kings to antagonize the Jews. Quite the opposite. Now, we have actually quite concrete evidence of exactly this policy of toleration that I've been trying to chart in the Seleucid realm. And it comes in a letter from King Antiochus, written to his governor in Judea, and it's recorded for us in Josephus in his work, The Jewish Antiquities. And I'd like to read to you part of this because it's very important to keep in mind that this is the background out of which the persecution will grow. King Antiochus to his governor, greetings.
So he's talking about Antiochus III, not Antiochus IV. Just want to make that clear.
Since the Jews, when we entered their country, at once displayed their enthusiasm for us, and when we arrived at their city, received us magnificently, and came to meet us with their senate, and have provided abundant supplies to our soldiers and elephants, and assisted us in expelling the Egyptian garrison on the citadel.
So listen to that. That's very interesting. This is recorded by Josephus, that's saying that Antiochus III, that when we came into Judea and brought Judea into the Seleucid Empire from the Ptolemaic Empire, they welcomed us with open arms. They even helped us remove the Ptolemies, to kick the Ptolemies out to go back to Egypt. This is what Antiochus III is saying, according to Josephus, is that the Jews in Judea helped us defeat the Ptolemies here in Judea to push them back into Egypt. Wow.
Came to meet us with their senate, and have provided abundant supplies to our soldiers and elephants, and assisted us in expelling the Egyptian garrison on the citadel. We thought it right to repay them for these services and to restore their city, which had been destroyed by the accidents of war, and to repeople it by bringing back to it those who had been scattered abroad. And he goes on to detail in quite astonishing detail all of the steps to be taken to help the Jews back on their feet by sending them wine, oil, frankincense, wheat, salt, pieces of silver. And he says, I wish these grants to be made to them in accordance with my instructions, and the work on the temple to be completed together with the stowers and anything else which needs to be built. We're actually finding here a Seleucid policy of helping to rebuild the temple that's been damaged.
Wow. So the temple suffered some damage, and I mean, it was 300 years old by this point, 400 years old by this point. So probably some decay, some damage. Antiochus III is helping the Jews build the temple, rebuild the temple, giving them supplies and things that they need to rebuild their temple. Antiochus III, the father of Antiochus IV. Wow.
Grants to be made to them in accordance with my instructions, and the work on the temple to be completed together with the stowers and anything else which needs to be built. We're actually finding here a Seleucid policy of helping to rebuild the temple that's been damaged. The timber required for the woodwork shall be brought from Judea, from the other nations, and from Lebanon, and no one shall charge any duty on it. So a tax-free importation of the necessary goods for rebuilding the temple. And here, Antiochus III goes on to say, and this is a very important clause, all the people of the nation shall govern themselves in accordance with their ancestral laws, and the Senate, the priests, and the scribes of the temple, and the temple singers shall be exempt from poll tax, crown tax, and salt tax.
Wow.
He goes on to give further examples of his beneficence. And
Antiochus III sounds like Cyrus the Great. Here. He sounds like basically it sounds like the Edict of Cyrus that you should go back to your land, rebuild your temple, live by the customs between you and your God, completely tolerant. And this is what makes what Antiochus IV, what he does in the 2nd century, makes it so, bizarre, out of nowhere. Why out of nowhere? Antisemitism? You're telling me it's antisemitism out of nowhere that he would choose to persecute the Jews the way that he does.
And the scribes of the temple and the temple singers shall be exempt from poll tax, crown tax, and salt tax. He goes on to give further examples of his beneficence. And later on, Josephus goes on to add that there was another clause in the letter from Antiochus. And again, this is quite remarkable. He says, "No foreigner shall be allowed to enter the precinct of the temple, which is forbidden to the Jews, except for those who are accustomed to doing so after purifying themselves in accordance with the ancestral custom." So fairly clearly, what this document seems to show is that there is a policy not just of tolerance, but of actual respect on the part of the Seleucid kings.
Wow. So that's what I'm saying. So for 400 years, from the Persians through the Ptolemies, through even the beginning of the time that Judea was part of the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus III, that it was complete tolerance. Not only tolerance, respect. I mean, that it's just completely out of the ordinary for Antiochus IV to do what he did. What was motivating him is the question. What was motivating him? We're going to get into more of asking that question, and I'm going to, not tell you the answer, but see if you can, by the information that I give you, come up with your own conclusion about what the motivation was for Antiochus IV to act completely out of the ordinary, to ignore, 400 years of history going back to the Persian Empire, that he's just out of the ordinary going to start persecuting the Jews, defiled their temple, bring them under subjugation. Let's talk about the high priest. The high priest of Israel was a very important post in Judea at this time. And because we talked about this period, the Second Temple period, and that it's also called 400 years of this 600 years is called the silent years, the period of time where the Jews are not only they're not only not under the Jewish kings anymore. There's no more Jewish prophets, kings. The high priest goes back. The position of high priest goes back to Aaron and Moses and the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood. There's always been a high priest to, preside over the temple duties. But the high priest became something different in the Second Temple period. The Kohanim is what you call them. And it says right here, the high priest referred to by a number of titles in the Hebrew Bible. The title Kohen Gadol did not become dominant until well into the Second Temple period. The position of high priest began to take a different form in this period of the Second Temple period, where you're not under Jewish kings, you don't have any Jewish prophets anymore. The canon is closed, and so the high priest becomes not only the highest spiritual voice in the area of Judea, he's also the highest political voice. He has this both spiritual and political role that the high priest begins to take in Judea. And in the book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, it talks about two high priests at this period of time. One or many, there's talk about many high priests, but ones that we want to focus on are Jason. You can see here, Jason was the high priest during the time of Antiochus IV. So he becomes very important. And then Menelaus is another one. And then Menelaus, you can also see, is the high priest during the time of Antiochus. I have this clip from Professor Abramson, and he goes into a little bit about what Second Maccabees says about these high priests. Take a listen. What was going on in Judea during the time of Antiochus IV, and could this have had something to do with it? Take a listen.
The thing is, Antiochus inherited an internal dispute among Jews, among those who were in favor of increasing their commitment to Hellenistic values.
Listen to what he's saying, that Antiochus inherited an internal feud, that there was a feud going on amongst Jews in the area of Judea. And this feud that was going on in the area of Judea was against these two factions, these religious faction of Jews, these Orthodox Jews that wanted to keep orthodoxy, and these Hellenistic Jews that were becoming more influenced by Greek Hellenism, embracing Hellenism, even embracing polytheism, most of these dividing these factions were there was really only one urban area at this time, one city, and that was the city of Jerusalem. But you had many other Jews that lived outside of the urban area of Jerusalem. They lived in the hills, in Samaria, and all these places, in these small rural areas. And the people in the rural areas, much like today, even in the United States, people in the rural areas were more conservative, more Orthodox. The people that lived in the urban areas, the areas of Jerusalem, they were more prone to take on the Hellenistic identity, even polytheism, and stray away from Orthodox Judaism. So that's why I was telling you that the Maccabean revolt, you have to understand it wasn't just Jews against the Greeks, against the Seleucids. When the Maccabees rose up, when they started their war, they started their war and their revolt against other Jews, against Hellenistic Jews. Going back to this clip of Benjamin Netanyahu that I played in the last podcast. And this was comments that he made during Hanukkah this year or last year in December. And listen to what Netanyahu says here again.
Are fighting today the battle that the Maccabees fought. They fought for the survival of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith against an enemy that wanted to extinguish us.
Yes, they were fighting Antiochus Epiphanes, but they were also fighting Hellenistic Jews. And this is the question that I want to ask, because I'm telling you, there was two different, factions of Jews during this time, during the Maccabean revolt. Benjamin Netanyahu, do you think that he would align with the Maccabees? And I know that if you don't know the story, we're going to get more into the Maccabees, who they were, what they did in the next podcast. But let me just say, the Maccabees were very, very religious, Orthodox Jews that followed Jewish laws and Jewish customs very strictly. And they were fighting against other Jews that were more secular, they were more Hellenistic, and maybe practice different forms of polytheism and all this stuff. The question I'm asking, do you think Benjamin Netanyahu would more align with the secular Jews that the Maccabees were fighting, or would he align with the Maccabees? And that's the same thing today. I mean, not all Jews fall under the same umbrella. They're not a monolith. Some of them are very religious and honor God. Some of them don't even believe in God at all. Some of them are atheists. Some of them believe in other stuff. Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu would be more aligned with the Maccabees, or would he be more aligned with the secular Hellenistic?
Are fighting today the battle that the Maccabees fought. They fought for the survival of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith against an enemy that wanted to extinguish us, wipe us out from the face of the earth.
Yeah, the Maccabees sure did.
Our battle.
The Maccabees sure did want to extinguish and wipe out the Hellenistic Jews and the secular Jews. They absolutely did. All right, back to Professor Aberson here, talking about this divide, this internal fighting that Antiochus IV inherited when his father died.
In Israel itself. The thing is, Antiochus inherited an internal dispute among Jews, among those who were in favor of increasing their commitment to Hellenistic values and increasing their tolerance of polytheism, which is something that traditional Judaism looked down upon very strongly. And on the other hand, there were those who were more traditionalists who said, no, this is too much. You can't take us in this direction. It was a urban-rural divide, with Jerusalem in particular being dominated by Hellenizing elements, and the countryside tending to be favored by the traditionalists. Now, Antiochus, who was stinging from some military losses and had a significant tax burden that he had to raise from his population, began to become involved in this internal dispute because the highest office that Jews could hope to reach in Israel was the office of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And there were two major factions who were vying for it: the Hellenists, which were favored by a man named Jason, and another even more extreme figure named Menelaus on the one hand, and the traditionalists who favored someone named Chonia, also known as Onias. The Hellenists, first with Jason and then even more so under Menelaus, offered Antiochus more tax revenues, specifically suggesting that they would raid the temple treasury itself. And
Wow.
so Antiochus, who otherwise would never have gotten involved in such a suit, backed the Hellenizing party, first Jason and then later Menelaus. And after one humiliating military and political defeat, Antiochus chose to press his advantage with the Hellenizing elements by ransacking the temple himself.
Do you understand? Do you understand what's going on here, folks? You understand what's going on here, folks? That there were Jews that sided with Antiochus IV, and they sided with Antiochus IV because he had the big army, and they wanted him to be on their side against these Orthodox Jews that were causing them trouble and trying to battle for the control of the position of high priest, because the position of high priest was a powerful position, not only spiritually, but politically. So you have this fighting going on between these factions that were going on in Judea, and one of the Jewish factions sides with Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV decides to press the issue, is what Professor Aberson says here, and to show those religious Jews that we're the boss. So I'm going to come into the temple. I'm going to desecrate the temple to show you religious Jews that are in the countryside who's boss, that we're in control. And he's doing that with the help of these, as the book of Maccabees 1 says, these renegade Jews, these Jews who I believe Benjamin Netanyahu would be aligning more with. That's why I say, when people say that the Jews from the Bible are not the Jews from today, which Jews are you talking about? Because there's this sect of Jews from this period of time, the Second Temple period, the period of the Bible, the period that Jesus is born into, the period, the type of Jews that Jesus looked in their face and said that you are part of the. I mean, why do you think that this whole idea of this corrupt priesthood? Malachi talks about it in the book of Malachi when he shuts the canon, that the priesthood was already corrupted. And when Jesus comes on the scene, of course, that's why the whole him whipping the money changers at the temple, the whole priesthood had become so corrupt. It had become so corrupt. And it was corrupt during this time, during the period of Antiochus Epiphanes. And these corrupt Jews sided with Antiochus Epiphanes.
And so Antiochus, who otherwise would never have gotten involved in such a suit, backed the Hellenizing party, first Jason and then later Menelaus. And after one humiliating military and political defeat, Antiochus chose to press his advantage with the Hellenizing elements by ransacking the temple himself, dedicating it to Zeus rather than to the God of the Jews, and banning many traditional aspects of traditional Jewish practice, such as circumcision and the observance of the Sabbath. This sparked a revolt, but the roots of the revolt were really between the Jews themselves, between those Jews who wanted more accommodation to
Absolutely
Hellenistic values
correct.
on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who disagreed and said that the Greek world had to be held at an arm's length.
I mean, it was Jewish against Jewish. That's what started it. I mean, the whole reason that Antiochus Epiphanes got into it was taking one of the sides of one of the Jewish factions in these two competing Jewish factions, which even after the Maccabean revolt, during the Hasmonean dynasties, you still had factions leading all the way up to Herod the Great. That's what the Hasmonean Civil War was about. And that's why the Romans have to get in and intervene in the Hasmonean Civil War. It's interesting because even after the Maccabees are successful, and they're successful at establishing the Hasmonean dynasty, the empire does not become less Hellenistic. It becomes more Hellenistic. It does, that is, even though the Maccabees are successful, it doesn't stop the tide of the Jews becoming more Hellenistic, even up into the time of Jesus and the high priest at that time, Caiaphas, and others. Anyway, almost out of time. I want to listen to one more clip here from the professor. Take a listen.
Well, it is important to keep in mind that throughout much of the 3rd century BC, the 200s, Judea had been under Ptolemaic rule. In other words, it had been the far northeastern edge of Egyptian territory. And the generosity of the Seleucids...
Like I was telling you in the last podcast, because the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were fighting each other and keep like the Ptolemies would invade, because they were fighting over this region called Syria, which is just north of Judea. So the Ptolemies would march into the Seleucid area, and then the Seleucids would march down into Egypt, and all these armies had to pass through Judea. Judea, it was a very focal point for both of the armies, for the Ptolemaic army and for the Seleucid army. The important thing to understand is that the area of Judea had just come under control of the Seleucids under Antiochus III. It had only been part of the empire for 2 decades when the Maccabean revolt happens. So Ptolemy didn't want to lose control of this region because it's a very important region in the back and forth war between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. That's important to understand when asking the question, what motivated Antiochus? Wasn't anti-Semitism.
Of Egyptian territory. And the generosity of the Seleucids and Seleucid policy towards the Jews had been prompted by an awareness that Judea was a buffer state between Egypt to the south and southwest and Syria to the north. It was what some people would call a contested borderland. The arrival of the Romans in the eastern Mediterranean, the defeat of Antiochus III in 189, the prospect of an alliance between the Romans and Ptolemaic Egypt all represented severe threats to the power of the Seleucids in the eastern Mediterranean. Because in 168 BC, Antiochus IV faced the prospect of a Roman-Egyptian alliance, even at the same time as a new independent kingdom, that of the Attalids in Asia Minor, had also come onto the scene as an ally of Rome. So, it was possible that now, in the 160s, the kingdom located in Syria, controlled by the Seleucids, could face enemies prosecuting territorial claims to Judea, enemies that would control the entire seacoast from Byzantium all the way down today, the western coast of Turkey, the southern coast of Turkey, and then in the south, along the coast of Libya, Cyrenaica, Egypt, and the Gaza Strip. In other words, the Syrian kingdom was facing a coalition of enemies on its western front, north and south as well. It is under these circumstances that the luxury of an autonomous Judea could no longer be afforded. And so I would assert then that the shift in policy that we find between Antiochus III and Antiochus IV comes not from any change in religious or cultural conditions. It is not an attempt to impose Hellenism at all. It is in fact a pragmatic, cold-hearted political decision designed to bolster the Seleucid control of what we have called a contested border zone. It can no longer be independent and allied. It must now be under their direct control.
As a matter of fact, so the factions that were fighting for control of the priesthood, some of them were even threatening that Antiochus Epiphanes, that we're going to go back we're going to support the Ptolemies if you don't do something to rein in these religious Jews that keep giving us trouble and they're trying to capture the priesthood. You don't do something, then we're going to go back to Egypt. They even made that threat to
of what we've called a contested border zone. It can no longer be independent and allied. It must now be under their direct control. Already following his campaign in 169, Antiochus had carried off some treasures from the temple. He'd shown that his policy of generosity could be withheld or reversed when more pressing needs, not vague cultural notions, but specific pressing needs such as an empty war chest, arose. That's what dictated this policy. Now, while Antiochus was in the south, campaigning on the edges of Egypt in 168,
this is a very important part.
He received the news that a rebellion had broken out in Judea.
All right, so Antiochus IV is on a campaign in Egypt, okay? So for him to get into Egypt, he has to pass through Judea, and Antioch, his capital, is to his back. So he's in Egypt and fighting the Ptolemies, and he gets news that a rebellion between these, or not rebellion, a revolt between these two different Jewish factions in Judea breaks out while Antiochus IV is in Egypt with his capital, Antioch, to his back.
Now, while Antiochus was in the south, campaigning on the edges of Egypt in 168, he received the news that a rebellion had broken out in Judea. Probably this violence was actually the result of civil unrest between rival Jewish factions. And it was not really an uprising against Antiochus at all. But to Antiochus, who was out of his kingdom and was campaigning south of Judea, it must have seemed as if the Jews had turned on him when he was most vulnerable. Furious, he returned to Jerusalem where his armies, so it is said, slaughtered 40,000 Jews. And the following year, a Seleucid general named Apollonius was dispatched with 22,000 men to occupy Jerusalem, and specifically the citadel known as the Acra, the high point. From the Jewish point of view, preserved in the book of Maccabees, this campaign and occupation was designed to terrorize the population. According to the Jewish sources, these men came with orders to kill all the men and to enslave the women. This, in fact, did not eventuate, although, of course, some innocent people were killed. But if we strip away the preconceived notion of Greek and Jewish antipathy that always bedevils the discussion of these events, I think we can find a more plausible explanation. And it is this. Apollonius' army was being sent to establish a Seleucid garrison deep in Judean territory. That is to say, deep into the region to the southern side of Syria, and to secure this region against either a combined Egyptian-Roman attack or a rebellion of the local population against Antiochus on his vulnerable southern flank, or both. One could imagine easily a triumphant Ptolemaic campaign of an army marching across the Gaza Strip and up into what is now modern-day Israel and heading towards Syria, and promising liberation to the Jews if they were to join in the attack on the Syrian kingdom of Antiochus. Such a thing had happened in the 3rd century, certainly, when much of this region had been under Ptolemaic control. So, according to this interpretation, I would suggest that it is territorial and geopolitical considerations that were vastly more important to Antiochus than the questions of Hellenism, Judaism, or
religion,
any other ism.
Or any other ism. And it was pragmatic because he was fighting this multi-front war, and Judea was unstable because of the factions within Judea. But then the action that Antiochus and his generals take, that is what inspires the Maccabees to rise up. And they rise up and not only fight the Hellenistic Jews, but they also fight the Greeks. They're very successful, and they create the Hasmonean dynasty because of their success. We'll get back into this in the next podcast, talking about the Maccabees specifically and what they do when they rise up against the Seleucids. And you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.